Hello, and welcome to this panel as part of The Economist's ESG and Climate Risk Week. I'd like to thank The Economist for organizing this conference and inviting me to moderate this panel. And I'm really honored to be joined by some very esteemed business leaders working on sustainability and here to discuss how we kickstart ESG as part of the risk management journey. I'm Michelle Tuvison, Executive Director at the Center for Risk Studies at the University of Cambridge Judge Business School. And today we have leaders from some very important businesses and sectors who can give us their views related to the various dimensions of ESG. And with the understanding that the discussions have wide-reaching implications on society when it comes to the social elements of ESG. Given the breadth of this topic, I'd like to dive right into the panel discussion and start with some introductory questions for our panel members. And as with the other speakers in the conference, full bios can be viewed on the website. So I'd like to start by introducing Thomas Becker, Vice President of Sustainability and Mobility Strategy at the BMW Group. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining our conversation.
Thank you so much for the invite, Michelle, and look forward to this discussion.
Thomas, it'll be interesting to start our conversation with the transportation sector, given how front and center ESG has been for that sector, especially from the perspective of emissions. And BMW's leadership have made some bold commitments, including climate neutrality by 2050 and signing up to the Paris Agreement and Science-Based Targets Initiative for business ambition for 1.5 degrees Celsius. So given that, what sort of governance should be used to impose a stringent ESG framework so that various stakeholders can get more transparency into the actual progress?
Thank you. Exactly. This is what it is about. It's about credibility and about trust, which is one of the scarcest resources, namely in the conversations around mobility. And as you said, we have a commitment to reduce our CO2 footprint from raw material extraction to the kilometer driven on the road by 40% until 2030. And clearly, we want to be fully online with a 1.5 degree objective before 2050. But clearly, there are many variables here. And as you all know, a big piece of the solution is electrification of the drivetrain. That means new materials being needed from new sources that weren't part of the value chain of the automotive industry so far. This is all happening in an industry where a company like ours has tens of thousands of suppliers, nearly in every corner of the world. So managing a value chain in a way where you have the highest possible reliability of meeting ESG criteria is essential and needs governance, which also needs to work in practical life. And this means that, for example, we want to track the CO2 footprint of the material that goes into our product to the farthest extent possible, why we initiated an initiative called Catena X to collaborate on a shared digital platform on providing that information in a reliable manner, including also the ability to check and audit information we are receiving. And namely, if you look at the materials that go into the battery value chain, if you look at cobalt, at lithium, at many of the minerals, we have a combination of the E and the S dimension. This is about a responsible mining, for example, where we engage in a variety of activities, and being able to document this, to have it also checked as part of our integrated corporate report, I think is essential for the credibility of what we are undertaking.
Thank you, Thomas, and so many points to come back to. Very interesting indeed. Next, I would like to introduce Vikram Lothar, Chief Financial Officer at ADM. Vikram, it's great to have a CFO's perspective within the sustainability discussion. And the CFO is often referred to as the voice of reality for a public corporation, and your role must also give you an incredible cross-sectional view across the organization. Can you share with us some of the standout initiatives that ADM has introduced that are helping to advance its ESG goals?
Yeah, thank you very much. Nice to be here, Michelle. I'd say, firstly, it's important to understand that the global food system actually contributes to about 26% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. we believe as ADM that we have a unique position to help decarbonize the industry. And specifically, ESG is a very important integrated element to our strategy, operations and business, which are fundamentally aligned to three global trends: food security, sustainability, and health and well being. So, let me give you a few examples of what we are doing to help decarbonize the industry. On the supply chain, we obviously source crop from farmers. We don't farm, but we source crop from farmers. We are working with farmers actively throughout the globe to help reduce the carbon footprint of farming practices through regen ag, through different types of farming practices, covered crops, etc. And that's a very important initiative given the amount of greenhouse gases that are associated with farming practices. Then we're also introducing a lot of products within ADM that will drive and are driving greenhouse gas reduction, decarbonization of the food system. For example, plant-based proteins. We have been in plant-based proteins for many years, and we are launching new products on a regular basis. And there was a recent study conducted by BCG that suggests that with an 8% penetration of alternative proteins into animal proteins, you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 1.5%. So that's another way we are participating in that value chain. And we also produce ingredients for the fuel industry. Biofuels is going to be an important part of the energy transition. We participate in providing feedstock as veg oil to renewable green diesel, which, by the way, reduces the carbon footprint 85% versus petroleum based diesel. We're also looking at ways that we can participate in the sustainable aviation fuel industry, which is a drop in replacement for aviation fuel. And that aviation itself is a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions around the world. In addition to that, we're working actively to ensure that the people side of the equation is well managed. They are a vital asset for any company like ADM's to help drive that execution of that strategy, ESG linked. The development of the people, development of the talent, making sure we understand the inclusiveness, get diverse opinions, focus on D&I. All that is an integral part of our growth and our strategy. So a few examples, Michelle. I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Vikram. And we'll have so much to come back to. And I think the tension between the promises towards ESG commitments and the corporate balance sheet is a healthy one to maintain visibility. And I look forward to hearing your comments on that later on. Next, I would like to introduce Brendan Morrissey, Vice President of ESG at Walmart. Brendan, as you know better than anyone, Walmart is the largest retailer in the world. That position comes with many responsibilities towards people and planet. Can you give us some insights into Walmart's approach to ESG and how you decided what to focus on and prioritize?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. So our ESG strategy is a component of our overall business strategy to create long-term value for our stakeholders. So our customers, our employees, which we call our associates, our suppliers, business partners, communities, and the planet. And so we call that shared value. So, in 2 words, our ESG strategy is shared value. Given the breadth of our business, our product offering, where we are geographically, we could focus on dozens of things and, completely occupy our time, in all of those areas. But where we have decided to focus our energy is where it makes the most sense for our business and for those stakeholders. So we prioritize certain ESG issues based on relevance to our business, relevance to those stakeholders, our ability to affect change on the issue and see it back in our business and in value for those stakeholder groups. My team's role is to help interrogate those questions, make sure the company is focused on the right priorities that are going to make the most difference for our business, the most difference for those stakeholder groups, and make sure that we're focusing our time and attention and energy in those places.
Thank you, Brendan. It's always interesting to hear about what Walmart's doing and how you're prioritizing because there's so much to do. Next, I'd like to introduce Catherine Neve, Chief Sustainability and Philanthropy Officer at Duke Energy. Catherine, great to see you again and welcome. Congratulations on your new role, and it sounds very exciting. We're privileged to be able to tap into some of your planning as part of your role. If I could start by stating the obvious, that Duke Energy is a regulated utility with an obligation to serve its customers. So how has Duke Energy evolved forward, and where its ESG strategy is aligned to its business priorities?
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity to be here with you all today and to speak with all of you. I think my comments will really mirror a lot of what the previous panelists and in particular Brendan have spoken about. I think when I take a step back and think about ESG, to me, it really is it's a strategic question, it's a strategic decision, and it's for any corporation, any business, really, any organization, quite frankly. To me, it's about answering two questions. The first is, how do you mitigate risk, environmental and social risk primarily, and then also how do you create value, that environmental and social value. And this has been a field that's been through kind of a transformation or an evolution over the last several decades, where we really, I think, started and grounded a lot of this work in kind of corporate social responsibility, worthy work, but often kind of the nice to do. And then you kind of shifted into this world of sustainability, although sustainability still is used a little interchangeably with ESG, but it was kind of more of a like, you really should do it, a bit like eating your peas or doing your homework. And then now we're really in I think, a fundamentally different place where ESG really is a must do. And so I think there's such an opportunity for companies today to be really taking a look at what are those significant environmental and social issues that are out there, and how do they respond to those in a way that, again, creates that value for the business, but also for the communities served. I think one of the coolest things that I get to say working at Duke Energy is that our business strategy is our climate strategy. There really isn't any daylight between the strategic questions that we're asking of the business and the strategic questions that we're asking about how we get to net zero by 2050. And our work, like many of the other folks here on the panel today, has evolved. We set our first climate-related commitment in 2010. We've been talking about climate for 2 decades now, and in 2019 moved forward with a net zero goal for our Scope 1 work, expanded it in 2020 to take on the emissions affiliated with our gas business. Earlier this year, expanded the work even further to look at Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions, so really taking on the totality of our greenhouse gas footprint, while also really, I think, probing the questions that are to me really, really fundamental to the technical and the environmental question about climate, but really the social components of that energy transformation. So environmental justice, just transition, and all those other topics that are really closely interrelated to climate.
Thank you, Catherine, for those thoughts. And I look forward to coming back to some of the social elements and the unintended consequences of the ESG transition and so forth. And our final panelist is Misha Shieldman, Vice President of Strategy ESG Cloud at OneTrust. Misha, we've heard from a wide range of sectors and so many important points. And if we continue the theme of being closely tied to business, we immediately see that we have a lot of challenges in managing and organizing our plans and actions. So from where you sit, Misha, as a technology provider, what can software and technology do to help manage ESG programs and their associated metrics and KPIs?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Michelle, for the invitation and the question. And I think the examples that the other speakers gave just now are a real great example on how complex the domain, the ESG domain is, and how difficult it is to really improve business processes and the ESG KPI on a long term. And I think what we all are aware as practitioners, but what a lot of businesses out there do not really fully capture yet is how transformative the ESG process is, and how it deeply involves every stakeholder, whether it's suppliers, customers, partners, and employees. And to really set up an ESG program that is holistic and that is made for success, you need to kind of set up a system to monitor millions of data points from all stakeholders across the whole value chain. And only software is able to do this. Whether it's processing the data, whether it's the aggregation of supplier data or calculation of carbon emissions, which in itself is extremely complex, or also sharing data with customers to create trust. And I think this aspect of trust is also something where software really plays an important role, because the data that is the underlying data to set up these ESG programs needs to be reliable, needs to be trustworthy, so that it can also be verified and also be the basis for certifications, which then can be published on data platforms, such as the OneTrust ESG Cloud, and to be able to create trust across the supply chain, to suppliers, to customers, which we believe is like a major theme going forward towards a more sustainable world, right? Because in the end, companies can only reap the benefits of becoming more sustainable if their stakeholders also have trust in the data that has been provided and in the figures and the KPIs that are published. And software is in the best place to provide exactly that trust across all relevant stakeholders and platforms.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for your introductions, for providing so many points to go back to and revisit. I'd like to continue where some of you left off about materiality of ESG to the business. So firstly, how do companies define material risks, ESG risks, and then subsequently addressing their impact on the business? So Brendan, if we could start with you from your vantage point at Walmart, and then move to Catherine from a very different kind of business, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And based on Catherine's opening comments and knowing her well, I think our answers will be similar in theme, but different in application. So I look forward to hearing what she has to say. I'm coming at this from a perspective of not just risk, but also opportunity, which is similar to a comment that Catherine made earlier. So certainly businesses need to consider key risks, but it's just as important to consider key opportunities. The foundational aspect of running a successful company is looking around the corner and really trying to identify what are the things that are out there that can impact your ability to create value. So good businesses have always done this. They want to see where their customers are going, what the competition is doing, and play both offense and defense, within their market, and really try to create value for the long term. The difference that I see here in the ESG space is really just a broadening of the aperture and a recognition that more things matter for that ability to create long-term value than I think was previously recognized. And so as we think about this from a perspective of defining material ESG risks and opportunities, defining material ESG issues and their impact on the business, it's really about understanding your business strategy. So, in the opening question I was asked, how do we define, how do we narrow down what we, spend our time on and what we don't? We do that essentially by interrogating our business. So how do we plan to grow and serve our customers better in the future? Where do we have critical dependencies? Are there places where we know business as usual, isn't sustainable in the long term in sort of an environmental sense or in some other sense? And we ask all those questions about our business strategy. And then what are the factors that bear on all of that? So for a business like Walmart, that leads us to a very different place than it would Duke Energy, or it would BMW, or it would ADM, or some of the other panelists here, because of the nature of our business and where we're trying to take it. So, product supply chains, our business right now is very dependent on our ability to, source, transport, sell products that our customers need and love in over 10,000 locations around the world. And our long-term strategy is to continue doing that. So as we look at that business, what the dependencies are there in terms of the ability to source those products, grow those products, manufacture those products for the long term, there are social environmental factors that bear on our ability to do that, to execute our core business strategy. And so what we're trying to do is look at those aspects with particularity. Where are those dependencies? Where are the sticky points? Where are the things that we need to unlock so that we can continue that business and ideally do that better than the competition. So that's the way that we're thinking about this. It's a people business. Retail's a people business. We have a dependency on having great, associates in the future, more so than in other industries, a large frontline workforce. And that's always going to be the case. So again, as we look at our long-term business strategy, it depends on that. It depends on finding people, upskilling them, keeping them, retaining them, growing them, and helping them be their best so that they can continue to serve our customers in the way that they want to be served 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. We can't just go out to the market and find that. So that really shapes our strategy when it comes to the social component of what we do from an ESG perspective. So those are just two good examples, I think, of the nature of our business and where we're trying to take our business, really shaping where we're going from an ESG perspective.
Okay. Thank you, Brendan. And Catherine, from a different business perspective?
Yeah, but I think a similar approach and point of views as to what Brendan laid out. And so trying to think of what I can add to the conversation from what Brendan has already offered. I go back actually so in several lives ago, I worked at WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, for a number of years. And we would occasionally be approached by companies who would say, look, I've got it. I need to do something. And at the time, I think it was the kind of corporate social responsibility era, but I need to do something. And that was kind of the level of sophistication of the conversation was, I know I've got to do something here. And so we would always ask companies 2 questions. And these questions have kind of, to me, proven to be fairly evergreen in this space. The first question is, well, what matters to the company? And then the second question was always, and what does the company matter to? And they're really simple questions. The first one, what matters to the company, is often about risk, what is going to supply chain security, financial performance, all of that kind of stuff. And so there tends to be a real hyper focus on the risk question, rightly so, justifiably so. But I was always equally intrigued, and as Brendan laid out, so is he, in this question about, but what does the company matter to? And here, this is more about, is there a point of competitive differentiation for the company? Is there a place where the company in the ESG, sustainability, CSR, wherever you are in the continuum and of the work, is there a place for the company to really do something cool and exciting that's kind of revolutionary in a positive way? And so, as I think about this, I mean, you can do all of this. You can do a materiality review. You can incorporate in your enterprise risk assessment. You can do both formal and informal stakeholder engagement to try and arrive at your priorities and then figure out where you want to play on the chessboard of those issues. But to me, kind of having a really strong sense of purpose and guidance around what that company matters to can serve as a real North Star to help a company navigate not just what issues it works on, but what issues it may say, I really don't have a place to engage here that's going to be really meaningful. I'd far rather be focused here where I can truly make a difference on X or Y issues. So I think it brings that kind of focus to the table. And then I think once you've arrived at those priorities, the opportunity is really to figure out, well, where do you want to play in that space? Do you want to be the leading company on that issue? Do you want to be among a leadership set of companies, or do you want to kind of say, I'm going to be in kind of middle of the pack here? And any answer, not to be controversial, but any answer is okay as long as it's done with intention and with purpose. And so when I think about how companies define materiality or relevance or whatever the word of the day is, that's kind of how I recommend approaching it. And it's certainly how Duke Energy has been approaching it, where we really do understand climate as a risk, but also as an opportunity. And as I look at our ability to decarbonize, the sector's ability to decarbonize, I mean, this is a sector that makes a difference on an issue like climate change. And as I look at kind of the innovation, the economic development, the job growth, and all of these kind of corresponding benefits that will come along with the clean energy transition as we build out the renewables, as we think about advanced nuclear storage, hydrogen, all of these really cool, sexy sources of energy that are around the corner, is I think about all of that kind of coming together. That to me is incredibly exciting. And what an opportunity for a company like Duke Energy and others in our sector to really be leaning in on a topic that's top of mind for so many.
Great, thank you, Catherine, for that perspective, and agreed that it's a lot more exciting to talk about the opportunity. So why don't we move there? Enough of the risks and the risk disclosures. So maybe drill down a little bit to the specifics of the ESG elements, and that is supply chain and scope 3. Thomas, given where you sit within the automotive industry and one which has some of the most complex supply chains, could you start us off with some thoughts about suppliers and their role and the kind of opportunities there are in that space?
Absolutely. And coming back to what Catherine said, if you had done a materiality analysis for the automotive industry only not so many years back, it would have confirmed that what it is all about is emissions from the tailpipe of harmful substances, emissions of CO2 of the tailpipe, and properly managing your plants. So the materiality analysis, which we have just concluded, which is indeed about double materiality, impact from outside on us and our impact on the rest of the world, has strongly confirmed that those days are over. This is about, on the one hand, the transition into the electric drivetrain, and on the other hand, what matters is the entire system, including the supply chain, including, for example, the electricity that goes into the usage of the vehicle. So we have a big broadening of the view what actually matters. And in that regard, we have two dimensions. We have the climate dimension, and we have the resource dimension also as part of the E-pillar, and we have at the same time the social dimension. And that means that scope 3 upstream becomes a central part of climate as the dominant E dimension of what we are doing. So if we were just to electrify, just replacing the drivetrain and the energy storage system without doing anything else, we would have more emissions embedded in our parts than we have on the road even before 2030. So compared to such a business as usual scenario, we want to reduce the footprint of our supply chain by half. So you need to address steel, aluminum, plastics. And one of the solutions that you rapidly see is essential is circular. There is no linear way for our industry to get to 1.5 degree compliance in a linear business model. You need to close loops which are open now. And this means that, again, also, and here's a synergy and opportunity, the secondary material which you source from your customers has no risk in terms of use of natural resources, in terms of social abuses, etc. So going circular is, let's say, a multidimensional opportunity from a climate as much as from an S perspective, as much as from a risk management perspective. And this is why we are really investing heavily into that pathway.
Thank you, Thomas, for that. Vikram, I wanted to ask you from the supply chain and scope 3, how does that affect your world as the CFO?
Thanks for the question, Michelle. So our supply chain, as many of the panelists here, is also very complex. You think about it, we buy from farmers, right? So we source crop from hundreds of thousands of farmers. They're not regulated. So think about our ability, therefore, to manage scope 3. We came out and effectively said that we are going to reduce our scope 3 emissions by 25% by 2035 from 2019 base. And for that, you've got to measure, you got to work with your suppliers, with the farming communities, with your customers. On the customer side, it's relatively easy because many of them tend to be regulated. But the biggest challenge, frankly, is on the farming side. And how do we get around that? Someone else talked about that, is risk-based approach, right? You got to make sure you understand the risk and the corresponding impact and go after the parts of that supply chain that have the biggest opportunity in terms of sustainability as well as greenhouse gas reduction. And I think that's what we are working on. But for that also, the point that Misha made is very important. You need data, you need analytics, you need to be able to verify that data. Technology, software is going to play a pivotal role in trying to address that and make sure that we can validate and verify that and measure that and achieve our objectives.
Thank you, Vikram. Brendan, I wanted to go back to some points you made. It sounds like Walmart has had some great successes with its supplier management programs for reducing its Scope 3 emissions and including the other areas of sustainability improvements. Can you provide an example of a program with your suppliers that has really helped and lessons you've learned along the way?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So, our business is a business of working with our suppliers on across the wide range of things that we need to do to bring products to our customers. And so, as Vikram was just speaking to, the products that ADM is producing are the products that we're selling, right? And so, for us, when we think about Scope 3, it could almost be debilitating because you take that level and then you bring it across hundreds of thousands of SKUs that we sell across the world, and the idea of trying to accurately calculate, report, and draw down emissions over that expanse of business could be debilitating. But it's not debilitating because we know a few key things. One is that there's a small portion of our product categories that actually represents a large portion of our Scope 3 emissions. So that's one thing we know. The second thing that we know is that a small number of our suppliers are responsible for a large proportion of our emissions. And the third is that there are some common cross-cutting things that we as a retailer are able to catalyze and work with our suppliers on that can have a major impact when it comes to emissions across the supply chain. So once you know those things, you can actually focus your efforts in the right places to draw down emissions in the way that it's going to be most impactful for you and your business. So we've designed a number of work streams under the banner that we call Project Gigaton to address these issues. And so Project Gigaton, as the name would imply, is it's an effort to avoid, sequester, reduce 1 billion metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions between 2017, when the project launched, and 2030. And the idea here is there are real actionable steps that our suppliers can take on transportation, on packaging, on energy use, on nature, other things in the course of their business relevant steps to have a positive impact in their supply chains and therefore for the benefit of our Scope 3 footprint. And so by deploying real calculators, tools, initiatives, as well as bringing together suppliers who have common problems to solve them. So, for instance, on renewable energy, we were able to put together an initiative where several of our suppliers were able to procure renewable energy through a power purchase agreement that they wouldn't have had the ability to do otherwise, but for the fact that Walmart can act as a catalyst. By doing all of these things, we can have a positive impact in, our own Scope 3. So, we've decided that we could spend a lot of energy in trying to calculate a very at the best Scope 3 number, that we could possibly calculate and report it. Or we can spend more energy focusing on things that will really draw down emissions and create competitive advantage for us and, better prepare us for the future in line with the Paris Agreement. And that's where we're putting our energy right now. So great results today on that project. Great supplier engagement, 4,500 suppliers engaged, over halfway towards our goal. And so we feel good about it, but we're not taking our foot off the gas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great to hear. Misha, do you want to comment on some of the data needs and management tools that are available?
Yeah, pleasure. So I think kind of the most important tools, and that's also reflected in what the other panelists just mentioned, is from our perspective, tools to collect, aggregate, verify data from suppliers, because the supply chain is just a major source of, on the one hand, carbon emissions, but also social and governance related KPIs. And I think this is also extremely important to, and it was in line what also Thomas and Vikram said, is that you can not only look at carbon, because if you don't look at, for example, the social aspects or other environmental aspects, then you will not become a truly sustainable company. right? And that's why it's really important to take into account all ESG factors. The second piece, which we believe is crucial for, in the end, also the survival of the humankind, is carbon specifically, and having tools that are able to calculate emissions in an accurate way, to derive reduction measures automatically, data-driven, and also support the company in setting targets and achieving those, is for us key in driving a net zero society. And more on a meta level on top of this is, and this also relating to what Vikram said, is that this all needs to be embedded in a risk management environment, in risk management tools that allows you, especially the CFOs or the chief risk officers, to manage the risk that is across all business operations and proactively mitigate these risks. Just because, not only because obviously you want to improve your business, but also because they are very fundamental risks in your business activities that need to be managed, because otherwise you would be exposed to reputational risk, operational risks, which could affect your in the end your shareholder value creation, but also obviously your long-term business prospects.
Okay, thank you, Misha, for that. Catherine, I'd love to come back to a point you raised in the introduction about the just transition, which is a natural follow-on from managing suppliers. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how you're thinking about that?
Yeah. So Duke Energy is a very large utility in the United States, and we, as part of our February 2022 announcement to expand our net zero work to include Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions, we also provided some clarity around our plans to exit from coal generation. And we are leading the largest planned retirement of coal in the United States in our industry. So it's a very significant and important step forward as it relates to how we're getting to net zero. But at that same time, we're incredibly mindful that our exit from coal will potentially have an impact on communities where those coal facilities are located, as well as kind of adjacent communities in the supply chain. And then also our employees. Many of our employees, of course, work in the coal facilities today. So we have been working very robustly inside the company and partnering with external stakeholders who bring, I think, a really important perspective and subject matter expertise to bear to help us navigate this next decade of a decade plus of retirement. We will be roughly 95% out of coal from a generation standpoint in 2030, with the full exit planned pending regulatory approval in 2035. So on the one hand, we've got a nice window of time to be really thoughtful, measured, and intentional about how we navigate the just transition. But we're not learning from scratch. We have already retired. I'm working off of memory, but already retired approximately 56 coal units. So we've got a lot to learn about how we can address employee concerns, community concerns, and really land on the other side of this conversation in really the right way. We're certainly looking also externally at other utilities, both in the U.S. and abroad, to see how they're addressing some of these concerns. So really looking at reskilling and retraining programs for our existing workers, looking at community planning in the communities where we operate so that those community members have a seat at the table in with respect to where their community moves as we potentially retire those assets. And of course, we're looking at the sites where we've got these facilities to understand whether or not we can bring new forms of generation there or other alternatives into that community. And we'll, the kind of unique thing about being a utility with that obligation to serve all in our service territory is that we don't really leave communities, even as we sometimes retire assets over time. And so we will continue to have that presence in the community through existing employees, and of course with our customers that we're serving. So I'm not going to pretend that we've got the silver bullet and all of the answers, but I think what we're really evolving towards is, I think, a very thoughtful and measured approach.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Catherine. It's an important voice we don't always hear in the ESG conversation, the social innovation element of it.
Yeah,
so now
I
I'd like
often,
to...
not to cut you off, but one of the things I often say is the pace of a lot of the E is defined by how companies navigate the S of ESG, because I do think fundamentally we're talking about people at the end of the day and their experience with ESG. And so I think I've really appreciated the comments from my fellow panelists, because they've really underscored the importance of, it's not just the E, it's also the S.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So we've heard a lot of great ideas from the panel on innovation opportunities. I'd like to bring the conversation back, but full circle, on how we achieve the ESG goals within an organization from a governance perspective. So Thomas, you touched on governance at the start and leaning on that to achieve your goals. Can you help bring that into perspective with some of the comments we've heard from the others?
Well, I mean, very clearly, with product like automotive, it all starts with the overarching commitment and the targets being set by the board. And these are, for example, the cutting of our scope 3, 1, 2 CO2 volumes. So we have a very clear trajectory how we want to bring that down. And this is then translated in various manners. So there is a dedicated entity within our R&D division which translates the overarching targets into specific CO2 footprint numbers for each and every car model that we are launching over the next years. At the same time, the same targets are translated into the requirements we set for our suppliers within the purchasing division. Again, with the same principle, a dedicated centralized unit which has the method competency, which has also the interface to strategy, would then translate that, integrate that into the processes. So, for example, as a standard requirement, we require measures for reducing CO2 within the purchasing and qualification process. When we develop a new vehicle, we set not only a tailpipe emission target, we set a footprint target, which then has to be translated into material requirements, into technology requirements. And we will, over the next years, also increasingly design vehicles in a way that facilitates the reuse of the material in the, let's say, highest value manner, meaning supporting the possibility to make new cars again out of the steel that we put into the vehicles, knowing that today, for example, the shredder technology at vehicles' lives will not lead to the kind of automotive grade quality that we would need in order to just feed it back into the beginning of the supply chain. So a lot of things where the crucial success factor is the integration of ESG targets into the operation of people, and hundreds and thousands of them, whose job actually doesn't say sustainability, but says something totally different. And this is, I think, the big effort that is required within an organization like ours.
Thank you, Thomas. And Vikram, from where you sit in finance, how do you see the governance working best to achieve ESG goals in the business?
I think one of the most critical points raised by almost every panel member here is ESG needs to be integrated with the strategy, right? That's fundamental and foundational. So I personally, as CFO, have a great relationship with our CSO, our Chief Sustainability Officer. So firstly, you got to measure, and then you got to manage, right? So when you say measure, you set out your first measurements, you set out your objectives, but also very importantly, make sure that you've got a defined pathway to get to those objectives. And that's important and critical for any organization. And we've done that. We've established very clear goals. We have a defined pathway. We manage that, track that at the board level, because we've got a sustainable committee at the board level that oversees that, not just on the E side, but also the S and the G side. We have actually introduced a long-term incentive for executives linked to 2 ESG goals, both on gender parity as well as greenhouse gas emissions. While we've got an objective for 2035, we're tracking it every year. We've got mid-cycle milestones we've established. And more recently, we've also introduced, from a reporting perspective, which is the other aspect, an ESG controller. It's important that all that comes together from a reporting, validation, verification, auditing perspective. So that's the way I would summarize it. Governance is vital to an effective ESG framework and implementation.
Hey, well, thank you. And with that note, I would like to ask the panelists to help close this panel out. So it's been really marvelous how we've covered a lot of nuances of a company's ESG journey and what the business community might expect for the future. So now I'd like to ask each of the panelists to leave us with a final thought that brings hope for a productive journey towards achieving some of the most needed ESG ambitions. So shall we start and go around the room? Thomas.
Well, I think one of the biggest opportunity indeed is the technologies we have today. I mean, we can now address topics of a level of complexity that we would have been unable to manage 10, 15 years ago. So therefore, I think the digital infrastructure for managing ESG in complex supply chains, I think, offers a big opportunity in every aspect of that. And we need to drive that forward in a collaborative manner where the requirements for trust and reliability are built into the system, which is very easily said, but hard to be done, and certainly not to be done by just one entity at the end of the chain, like where we are. But I'm confident we get that done jointly.
Thank you, Thomas. Vikram?
I'll leave you with a stat. So the global population is expected to go to 10 billion by 2050. And actually, the amount of food that we're going to need to produce over the next 40 years is equivalent to the amount of food we produced over the last 8,000 years. There's only so much arable land and only so much incremental impact on yield. So the world has to find new ways of producing food. And the great news is there's a lot of investment that's going into doing that. Fermentation-based food products. A lot of you have, I'm sure, tasted those as well. We as ADM are actively engaged in that transition with the capabilities we have. So the future is bright. It's going to require partnership. It's going to require tactful investment and smart strategic decision making. So I'll leave you with that.
Thank you, Vikram. Catherine?
Yeah, I've just been reflecting on this conversation that sometimes in the world of ESG, you get into this like box of it's all about risk. And it's not, as we've talked about today, it's also about how you create value. And I think sometimes there's an instinct with risk to run away, to pretend it's not there, to look aside, to get away from it. And I think you've got so many different sectors on this panel today with really robust plans to transition to a net zero economy moving forward. And so to me, that gives me a lot of hope and a lot of encouragement, because you've really got some fundamental sectors of the economy that are working together, that are innovating, that are learning from each other as we all figure out how do we get from here to there most effectively. It's a really exciting time.
Yeah, very exciting. Thank you, Catherine. Brendan?
Yeah, I guess just a bit of advice, I would say, then not to my fellow panelists, because I think we're all saying similar things, but probably more for the audience. Focusing on the real, focusing on the practical, and focusing on what matters most for the business is really the path to success here, and staying focused on the mission at the end of the day. Businesses historically are good at that. At least successful businesses are. As I said earlier, broadening your aperture and just recognizing that more matters than you probably previously realized matters, in terms of what it takes to build a strong and resilient business for the future is the key difference. But businesses are good at this. It's just applying it in a new realm.
Yeah. Thank you, Brendan. And last but not least, Misha.
Thank you. Yeah, just from my perspective, I think the progress that has been made on business level, on so many levels in the last 2 years is astonishing. When I think back about working in strategy consulting, where the topic of sustainability was really niche, and in the last 2 years, it just became a C-level topic. There's so much urgency around it. There's so much action around it, and I think this. Makes me positive for the future. But I think it's also clear that we're just on the beginning of our path to a sustainable future, to a net zero society, and there's so much still to be done. So I'll also follow Brandon's advice to the business world to take action now, to start working on the issues at hand and work towards a sustainable future for all of us.
Thank you, Misha, for that very positive note. So thank you to all the panelists and viewers of the session. It's been my absolute privilege to moderate this expert panel. Have a great day.